The body was bisected at the waist with surgical precision, drained of blood before the cut. No hesitation marks. The incision was clean, the kind of clean that requires knowledge, practice, and the right tools. The FBI asked medical schools in the Los Angeles area to check their student and faculty records for anyone with the relevant skills. They found nothing. What they were looking for, and didn't find, was someone who had performed this specific procedure before, not in a medical context, as a killing. We found a case from 1934 in Cleveland, Ohio, that suggests the FBI was looking in the wrong city, and looking 13 years too late. Betty Bersinger was pushing her daughter in a stroller through the Limert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles on the morning of January 15, 1947, when she noticed something in a vacant lot off Norton Avenue. She initially thought it was a department store mannequin. The figure was too pale, too still, arranged too deliberately to be a person who had simply fallen. It was not a mannequin. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old. She had been born in Boston in 1924, had moved to California during the war years, and had spent the last months of her life in Los Angeles, working intermittently as a waitress while pursuing acting work that had not materialized. She had no criminal record. She had been briefly arrested for underage drinking in Santa Barbara in 1943, which placed her fingerprints in FBI files, a fact that would allow investigators to identify her within 24 hours of the body's discovery. The body had been placed in the lot. It had not been dumped. It had been positioned. The woman was lying on her back, arms raised above her head and bent at the elbows, legs straight and slightly apart. She had been drained of blood before death, or immediately after. No blood was present at the scene, and the body was completely exsanguinated. She had been bisected at the waist with a single clean cut through the lumbar vertebrae. The two halves of the body had been washed, probably with a hose. The skin showed the marks of prolonged ligature. She had been bound, and bound for an extended period. There were cuts on her face, lacerations extending from the corners of her mouth toward her cheeks, a technique sometimes described as the Glasgow smile, inflicted before death. The body had been killed elsewhere and transported to the vacant lot. The transportation had been recent. The condition of the body indicated she had died between 10 and 12 hours before discovery. Whoever had done this had somewhere to work, somewhere private, with a water source, with enough space to handle a body, and with enough time to complete a procedure of considerable technical difficulty without interruption. The LAPD assigned 750 investigators to the case at its peak. This is a staggering number, one that reflects both the horror of the crime and the pressure that the Los Angeles press had placed on the department within hours of the body's discovery. The newspapers had identified the victim by the morning of January 16th, given her a nickname, the Black Dahlia, a reference to the 1946 film Noir, the Blue Dahlia, and to Short's dark hair, and turned the investigation into the most covered crime story in Los Angeles history. The investigation interviewed more than 150 suspects. It received more than 60 confessions in the first weeks, and more than 500 over the following decades. None of the confessions were credible. Each was tested against details that had been withheld from the press, and each failed to demonstrate knowledge that only the killer would have. The killer, by contrast, demonstrated a specific and troubling awareness of forensic procedure. Everything that was mailed to the Los Angeles Examiner, Short's birth certificate, her address book, photographs, personal effects, had been wiped with gasoline before being sent. Gasoline dissolves the oils that constitute fingerprints while leaving the physical material intact. This is not common knowledge. It is operational knowledge, the kind of thing that someone learns professionally, either in law enforcement, in intelligence work, or through specific and deliberate study. The FBI was called in. They reviewed the physical evidence, assisted with fingerprint matching, and conducted their own investigative work alongside the LAPD. They examined the question of surgical skill with particular attention. The bisection of the body had been performed with such precision that medical training was considered almost certain. Investigators contacted medical schools. They contacted hospitals. They checked recent graduates and current faculty with relevant anatomical knowledge. They found no viable suspect through that avenue. The investigation went cold. The case was never closed. Between 1934 and 1938, a series of murders took place in and around Cleveland, Ohio. The victims, 12 confirmed, possibly more, were found dismembered. Their heads had been removed. In several cases, the bodies had been drained of blood before dismemberment. The dismemberment was performed with a level of anatomical skill that Cleveland investigators described, consistently, as consistent with medical or surgical training. The killer was never identified. The Cleveland torso murders, as they came to be known, attracted significant investigative attention. Eliot Ness, then serving as Cleveland's Director of Public Safety, following his work with the Untouchables, personally oversaw aspects of the investigation. The investigation was one of the most intensive in Cleveland's history. It produced no arrest, no charge, no conviction. The murders stopped in 1938, or appeared to stop. Investigators subsequently identified possible additional victims in other cities, but the connections were not definitively established. The parallels between the Cleveland murders and the Black Dahlia killing have been noted by crime historians for decades. The surgical skill, the exsanguination, the deliberate arrangement of remains, the absence of usable forensic evidence at the scene. They are not the same in every particular. The Cleveland victims were primarily men. The methods differed in some respects, and the geographic distance between the two cases has led many investigators to treat them as unrelated. But there is a specific detail in the Cleveland case that has not been adequately addressed in the context of the Black Dahlia investigation. Among the suspects investigated in the Cleveland torso murders was a physician. His name does not appear in the public record of the investigation. His connection to the case was established through private correspondence between Eliot Ness and a colleague, correspondence that was not made public until decades after both men's deaths. The physician was interviewed and released. He was not charged. Ness described him in the private correspondence as the most likely suspect, but noted that the evidence available was insufficient for prosecution and that the physician's social connections made an aggressive investigation politically difficult. The physician left Cleveland in the late 1930s. His subsequent movements are documented in professional records. He maintained a medical practice and continued to appear in professional directories through the 1940s. In the late 1940s, those professional records place him in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. We want to be precise about what we are and are not claiming. We are not claiming this physician killed Elizabeth Short. We are noting that a man who Eliot Ness privately identified as his primary suspect in the Cleveland torso murders, a series of killings characterized by surgical skill, exsanguination, and careful avoidance of forensic evidence, was living in the Los Angeles area in January 1947. We are noting that when the FBI investigated the Black Dahlia killing and looked for someone with the relevant surgical skills, their search was confined to the Los Angeles area and to formal medical institutions. We are noting that someone who had been informally investigated for similar crimes in Cleveland in the 1930s would not appear in that search. Among the items mailed to the Los Angeles Examiner after the murder was Short's address book. The address book contained 75 names. Every person in the book was interviewed by investigators. None of them were charged. None of them were identified as the killer. The address book itself, the physical object, was returned to investigators after the newspaper's coverage. It was placed in the LAPD's evidence files. What was in the address book tells investigators something about Elizabeth Short's social world in the final months of her life. It was not the world of an isolated woman. It was the world of someone with a wide circle of acquaintances, many of them in the entertainment industry, some of them in more complicated circumstances. One name in the address book was Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner with whom Short had stayed briefly. Hansen became a person of interest. He was interviewed extensively. He was not charged. Another name, one that has received less public attention, appears in the address book, with a professional designation that links the person to the medical field. This person was interviewed in the initial investigation. The interview summary in the LAPD file is 3 sentences long. 3 sentences for a person with medical training, in an investigation defined by the question of who had the medical training to commit this crime. We requested the full interview file through a public records process. The full interview file does not exist in the publicly accessible portion of the LAPD archive. We are not saying it was suppressed. We are noting it is not there. The most prominent suspect theory in the Black Dahlia case was developed not by a journalist or a crime historian, but by a former LAPD homicide detective named Steve Hotel. In the early 2000s, Steve Hotel opened a box of his late father's belongings and found photographs. Some of them, he concluded, depicted Elizabeth Short. He spent years investigating his father, Dr. George Hodel, a prominent Los Angeles physician who had been one of the LAPD's 6 primary suspects in the original investigation. Steve Hodel's research, published in a 2003 book called Black Dahlia Avenger, identified his father as having surgical skills consistent with the crime, a known acquaintance relationship with Short, and a history of behavior, including a 1949 trial for the molestation of his daughter, that pointed to serious capacity for violence. The LAPD, when Steve Hodel contacted them, confirmed that George Hodel had been on the original suspect list. They confirmed that surveillance recordings had been made of his home. They confirmed that investigators had believed, at the time, that he was the most viable suspect. They also confirmed that the case had been closed, at the investigative level, not officially, when George Hodel left the United States for Asia in 1950. Steve Hodel's theory has been contested. In 2026, author William J. Mann published a detailed counter-argument challenging the evidence linking George Hodel to the crime. The debate continues. What is not contested? George Hodel was a Los Angeles physician with surgical training who was on the LAPD's suspect list for the Black Dahlia murder. He was surveilled. He was never charged. He left the country. We want to be clear about what we are laying out. The Black Dahlia murder has been the subject of more amateur investigation, more published theories, and more sensationalized coverage than almost any other unsolved American crime. We are not adding to the pile of speculation. What we are noting: the killing of Elizabeth Short required specific skills. The LAPD and FBI looked for those skills in the Los Angeles medical community and found nothing. The search did not extend to people with similar skills who had been investigated for similar crimes in other cities. The Cleveland torso murders were characterized by the same specific skills. The man Elliot Ness, privately identified as his primary suspect in those murders, moved to the Los Angeles area in the years before 1947. The address book found among Short's effects contained the name of a person with medical training. The interview with that person produced a 3-sentence summary. The full file is not in the public archive. The LAPD identified George Hodel as their most viable suspect. They surveilled him. They built a case. They did not charge him. They closed the investigative file when he left the country. We are not saying any of these things are connected. We are saying that the investigation that was conducted, the one that produced no arrest in 78 years, did not pursue the connections between them. We are saying that the shape of what was not investigated is as interesting as the shape of what was. Here is what we know. On January 15, 1947, Elizabeth Short was found in a vacant lot in Los Angeles. She had been bisected with surgical precision, drained of blood, washed, and positioned. The killer wiped all mailed evidence with gasoline. 750 investigators worked the case. 500 people confessed. Nobody was charged. The case is still open. George Hodel was the LAPD's primary suspect and was never charged. The Cleveland torso murders between 1934 and 1938 showed the same surgical skill. Elliot Ness privately identified a physician as his primary suspect. That physician moved to Los Angeles in the late 1940s. Here is what we don't know: whether the Cleveland physician and the Los Angeles murder are connected. What was in the full interview file for the medical professional in Short's address book? What the LAPD surveillance recordings of George Hodel's home contained? Why the investigative file was closed when Hodel left the country, rather than when the evidence was exhausted. We're laying out what we found. You decide what it means. If you know something we don't, you know where to find us. Subscribe, share this, and leave a comment. Because Elizabeth Short has been dead for 78 years, and the question of who killed her has never been answered. And the answer, if it exists, is somewhere in the distance between Los Angeles in 1947 and Cleveland in 1934.